History and Phenomenology. If it was not difficult to extract from the phenomenology of spirit a conception of time that is truly the time of a transcendental constituent activity, and that falls neither on the side of the constituted world nor on the side of the philosopher who thinks this world, it still remains to be seen whether this time is really capable of providing a foundation for a philosophy of history, without which the temporality of the real would always be something precarious, even illusory, and at the same time that would not be a history which would lack reality as much as a subjectivity without effective objectivity. This intuition, in which for Hegel time is realized, hardly seems capable of founding history, without which it would be empty. If history really only appears at the moment when the intuition of the concept in its totality surfaces in consciousness, then there can be no history except at the moment when absolute knowledge is close to being realized, and at the moment, therefore, when history itself is going to disappear. Between two experiences that would not be history, history would be the most fleeting of moments. But if history must really be a series of actual and lived experiences, then it must be admitted that it was already developing in a world where consciousness did not yet know time. Time only appeared at a moment when history had already unfolded in its quasi-totality. Time would thus be at the last moments of history, a moment which, by its mediation, is destined to express it. Between an extreme exhaustion of history as a fleeting moment of knowledge and extreme extension to a reality that does not yet know time, Hegel seems to have hesitated at times. In the Real Philosophy of Jena, he opts for the second hypothesis and refuses to see in the individual anything other than a blind link in the chain of absolute necessity, according to which the world must progress. Before any philosophical reflection, history was already there, expressing the energy of suffering and contradictions for which 2,000 years have commanded the world and forms of its culture. Conversely, several texts of the Phenomenology of Spirit show that Hegel did not want to dissociate history from knowledge and the intuition of time, and he refused to organic nature any temporal and historical dimension, and finally defined history as becoming actualizing itself not only in a reality, but in a knowledge. The reconciliation would seem impossible to attempt if it did not appear to be achieved for Hegel and considered by him as acquired in the introduction of the lectures on the philosophy of history. He recognizes there the two terms of the dilemma where confront each other, a history which would be subordination of reality to thought, and history which would limit itself to the understanding what is and has been events of its actions. But immediately these two terms are revealed as fundamentally identical, since history, he affirms, is the rational and necessary march of the spirit which develops in the life of the universe. Thus limited by the rational and necessary march of a spirit which develops in the life of the universe, the problem is to know how Hegel, starting from the phenomenology of spirit, from a history which risks very much being in the end only a branch of knowledge, was able to end up admitting as well in the same reality, knowledge is thought, and the real content of this knowledge, and how to deploy a reality from a thought of this reality. The analysis of the definition of time as it appears at the end of the phenomenology of spirit leaves no room for ambiguity. If it is true that time is the intuition of the concept, that is to say, the immediate grasp of its totality in its empty form, then it is impossible to admit that what has not yet acquired the form of this totality, and what is still only a fragmentary content seeking to totalize in a form that it does not possess, is part of of temporal realities. This is why perception has no history, and this is why Newton's law is true independently of the historical circumstances that may have given birth to it. This is also why history does not envelop organic life. In the multiple forms that it assumes, life it is, is doubtless a whole, but it thus constitutes so many totalities that oppose each other, which are constantly disappearing and finding a reality only in the continuity of species. And the totality of life is not only in the unity of each living being, but in the perpetual mobility, which goes from one to the other and drives out the first for the benefit of the second. The totality of life is therefore a dissociated totality, which for time, which each time it is on the point of being realized refers to another form of its same totality, a ceaseless rush into the singularity of being there. Perpetually, history escapes life, and life escapes history. For life to truly be whole, For this whole to be history, it would have to be a totality having an effective presence for consciousness. It would have to exist not only in each of its elements, but present immediately as a totality to a consciousness which would not associate it by grasping it. In other words, for the whole to be a whole, it must be a totality which immediately grasps itself in an intuition. As long as it does not intuit itself, the concept is a perpetual failure to realize itself. When this realization takes place, then time appears, and with it, history. Thus, everything is excluded from time and history, which is not a totality, which is immediately consciousness of itself. This is why, in the phenomenology of spirit, everything that is not yet spirit is not yet history either. But immediately, history thus conceived seems not only removed from reality, but located even beyond a science like the others. Not only does it appear only at the level of the mind, but it also must be the mind conscious of itself, the mind which does not relate to anything external to itself. It is to imply that history is also stripped of what characterizes it, even as knowledge. That is to say, of this exteriority by which the historian recognizes himself surpassed, enveloped, even if he does not recognize that this reality is of a historical nature. From the conception of history which appears at this level of phenomenology of spirit, on the one hand, what knowledge aims at is nothing other than knowledge itself. On the other hand, history, far from being the framework in which reality is only the immense deception by which knowledge knows itself, by which a concept immediately presents itself to itself. In reality, the conception of time does not cause history to lose all its consistency, as it might seem. If the concept has, in time, the immediate intuition of itself, this intuition, it does not present itself as interior to itself. At that moment, it would not be grasped intuitively. But conceptual knowledge of itself, it would be absolute knowledge and not intuition of time. For consciousness to be able to grasp the concept in an intuition, it must grasp it not only from the inside, but on the contrary, from the extreme form of exteriority. Intuition must make it present to itself as that which is fundamentally other than itself. Time is therefore the exterior pure self, the concept immediately before consciousness definitively recognizes itself in it. In time, the concept presents itself in the same form of exteriority which made the different objects appear for sensitive consciousness. One last time before absolute knowledge, the concept arises like this or like that. It manifests itself now like night and tomorrow like day. One last time, it alienates itself in the pure exteriority of being there. It is because time expresses the final alienation of the concept that history is not self-knowledge enclosed in a subjectivity that can never become effective. History is this exteriority of time in relation to consciousness. It is the totality of consciousness rejected outside of consciousness itself. In short, far from being at the origin of a purely subjectivist conception of history, the theory of time as intuition realizes the paradox of admitting that time only as knowledge, but of making history the last and most extreme of exteriorities in which mind risks getting lost before being able to return to its original land. History and time are therefore presented in a close correlation, where history is what time aims at, and time the mode in which history presents itself to consciousness. Time and history are the two aspects of the same reality, which can be, as one wishes, considered at the level of exteriority, at the level of interiority, as time, or as history. It would not be legitimate to object to this conception of history as a necessary alienation correlative to the intuition of the concept in time, that this alienation is perhaps only an illusory projection of a thought time onto a real totality, or that this destiny is in short only to recognize itself as an illusion, and by the same fact to disappear entirely. Rather, the immediate reality of an alienation is not to be judged on what will subsequently be its destiny, but it is to be measured on what led to its realization and constituted at the moment when it presents itself as alienation. If the totality of the development of consciousness presents itself as external to the consciousness which thinks it, it is because this totality was constituted up to the moment when it still lacked self-consciousness as a totality. That is to say, this totality excluded from itself what could have been such a self-consciousness. And self-consciousness as a concept of totality was for it the most foreign thing, since it was the totality that lacked this consciousness in order to be entirely totalized. It is at this moment that on one hand time is realized, and on the other hand, because it is realized in a relationship of exteriority, it is at the same time of this exteriority, that is to say, of history. If it is illusory for the consciousness that knows that it must disappear from the world, for the consciousness that experiences it because it arrives at it at the end of a long development and at its summit, then alienation is what is most real. The way in which man becomes aware of the historical world around him is not a subjective vision from which reality will always escape, rather a vision that is one and the same thing with what it aims at. Lived time is identified with history. In Hegel's example, if the Orientals do not yet know that the spirit or man as such is free, by that very fact they are not. But because they are aware that a single individual can and must be free, therefore the history of which they have this subjective vision is for them the history of an absolute monarch who transforms their own freedom, because it alone cannot be effective, into caprice, into barbarism, into a culmination or docility of passion. Their intuition of the concept of freedom is for them the very reality of this concept. Abraham's destiny was also to live the history of which he sought a subjective intuition. When, driven from his homeland, he sought a land that was not foreign to him, and a land where in the service of his God would be the very life of his people. The paradox of this alienation of history is therefore that the totality of the concept appears to the consciousness that thinks it as what can be most exterior to it. That nevertheless, the intuition that grasps this concept as exterior to it is not different from the concept itself. In Kantian terms, intuition and concept are not two different functions. Not only do they have a common source, but there reigns between them a harmony which makes each intuition really correspond to a concept. For Hegel, the time that I grasp intuitively is only one and the same thing with the history that effectively realizes time, although this history does not immediately present itself as interior to the subject as this intuition, which is time. Thus, it is these two aspects of history, exteriority and identity with the subject, which allow Hegel to think that history is a form of knowledge, and that the individual is a link in history, and that he can reverse and that he can even rise to the mastery of a greater length of the chain, since he recognizes what is the direction of this great necessity, in which admits that the concept is not yet internal to itself. Here, history finds not only its justification as knowledge, but also its effective reality of becoming. We can therefore define history as the totality of experience insofar as it takes the intuitive form of time. If at least we add this important restriction that this totality of experience is not yet entirely totalized as a conceptual form where it would be truly internal to itself. The very expression intuitive form indicates in what restrictive sense we must understand the totality of experience. But as it is given with the necessary restriction, the notion of totality of experience does not fail to pose problems. The first would be to know what are the relations of this totality with what it constitutes it. In other words, what is its historical status for the different moments of experience, which, in order not to present themselves as a totality, are not yet intuited in the form of time. But we must also ask ourselves what relations the totality of history has with the truly conceptual totality in which the intuitive form of time has vanished, and whether it is legitimate to admit a reality that places itself above history. In short, these are questions raised by the definition of history concern both below history, what is not yet history, and above it, what is no longer history. In the delimitation of a notion of history, a whole sector of experience has revealed itself as not being able to be truly historical. No more than organic life, the laws of understanding and reason cannot be historical, because they have not arrived at that unity in that whole which characterizes the spirit. As long as, on the one hand, the consciousness of being all reality has not arrived at its truth, but on the other hand, will not yet be that subjective and contingent certainty, then this consciousness will be separated from this reality that it thinks it is, since its certainty constantly and by the slightest of contingencies can be called into question and transformed into the most painful of skepticisms. But then this certainty which has reached its truth, then this truth which it will envelop in a whole total reality by the consciousness of being this reality. It is therefore possible that everything which is not spirit, and that is to say, everything which has not reached the totality of consciousness and reality, is not history, since history is the intuitive grasp of this totality. But the destiny of what is not spirit is to constitute the whole which will reveal itself as spirit, and it is to form this total balance in which the totality of experience will be realized. And each moment of the whole will appear by virtue of this destiny as that without which the whole would not have been constituted, without which the whole will reveal itself as already containing the whole in itself. In the realized whole, each moment will find in itself even its satisfaction. Instead of seeking in it what always is external to itself, it is enough for the spirit to reveal itself, for each part to become a spirit in its native element. And in this ascension of the spirit, the moments of sensible certainty will be able to take on the spiritual meaning of which they were stripped in the here and now. And the bread and the wine will enclose in their determinations the totality of the living spirit. Although they cannot belong as such to history, the different moments of experience therefore have, before the advent of the mind, the double character of being able to, in the totality of experience, take on historical meaning, and a constitution of this totality play the role of necessary and indispensable element. It is because there were moments which, through their incompleteness, called for the whole, that the whole was able to be constituted. So much so that in history we will find not what is historical, but which at each moment makes history possible. We therefore see two directions superimposed in the phenomenology of spirit. One follows the thread of experiences which do not belong to history, but which, through their totalization, make it possible. It develops under the moment of individuality, which knows itself to be real in itself and for itself. That is to say, until the first manifestation up to its animal kingdom. The other, on the contrary, deploys the experiences which are on the level with history, because they belong to the totality of the spirit. It shows the series of historical experiences which are thus juxtaposed along a horizontal line, going from the ethical substance of the Oriental peoples to absolute freedom, to the terror, to the reign of Napoleon. But for this horizontal development to be possible, it was necessary first to expose the vertical construction, which ranges from sensible certainty to reason. One would be quickly tempted to interpret these two successive directions in the phenomenology of spirit, seeing in the first a transcendental investigation which shows how experience as a totality is possible, and in the second the series of historical experiences in which this transcendental structure has manifested itself. Seductive in its simplicity, this possible interpretation would not take into account the fact that these two directions are superimposed in the theory of absolute knowledge, whose role is that of a constituent transcendental self, and which reveals itself, on the other hand, at the end of historical experiences as their completion. It therefore seems impossible to dissociate a properly historical orientation and a simply historical orientation, since history is not only the expression of a transcendental activity, but that it leads to this activity itself. Moreover, the problem would arise, doubtless insoluble, of knowing how and why the transcendental structure of the subject would express itself in these historical experiences. We must therefore, in any case, renounce the interpreting this double orientation of Hegelian phenomenology by dissociation between the possibility of experiences and the effective experience of history. The continuity of the two parts of the phenomenology of spirit is indicated by itself by the very strict correspondences that we find there, in which echo from one dialectic to the other. These correspondences are manifest and made explicit by Hegel on four different occasions. One, the first, time, we see paralleled the ethical order and the activity of self consciousness. Pleasure, the law of the heart and virtue. Second, we see a correspondence between the state of law with its three moments: validity of person, contingency of person, mastery of the world, and the dialectic of freedom in self consciousness: stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness. And third, natural religion takes up a dialectic of consciousness in a movement where corresponds the religion of the luminous essence and a sensible certainty, that of the plant to perception and the artisan to understanding. Fourth and finally, there's a correspondence between the spirit of absolute knowledge and equality with oneself. And this equality is in its difference the certainty of the immediate or the sensible consciousness. Apart from these precise but discontinuous texts, we can note a number of other more complex texts which would allow a parallel to be drawn turn by turn between the two parts of the phenomenology of spirit. We will attempt further on to give a synoptic and fairly approximate overview of this correspondence. From the first examination, this parallelism reveals that if the dialectics drawn in the correspondence have the same form, their content differs completely, to the point that that in the first series, the content, by the fact of its extreme contingency, ends up being almost entirely exhausted, while in the second series, it reveals itself as what is essential and fundamental. In an experience such as that of sensible certainty, the form appears as empty of all determined content, since the characteristic of this content is to be both this and that, and to be what is both now and just now. But in the experience of natural religion, which is the counterpart of the sensible consciousness, what is essential is the content of the experience. It is the pure luminous essence of the dawn, which contains and fills everything, which preserves itself in the formless substantiality, a reversal of form and content. A second characteristic of this parallelism, which between the two parts of the phenomenology of spirit, lies in the fact that it is not the first dialectics of one that corresponds to the first dialectics of the other, but that there is an inversion of the moment of the movement, and that thus the first spiritual experience, the ethical world, corresponds to the last of the non-historical experiences, that is to say, to the activity of reason. When it arrives at knowledge that knows itself and that has no reference to anything other than itself, it is to the immediate knowledge of sensation that Hegel expressly refers. We can say in a general way there's a correspondence between the ethical order and the active and legislative reason, between culture and the movement by which spirit becomes foreign to us, and the self-consciousness which goes from domination to freedom, between morality and the supersensible world and the laws of the understanding, between religion and pure and simple consciousness and its relationship of exteriority with its subject. This retrograde movement by which the supreme experience refers back to the first experience is understandable, since the spirit has been defined by the consciousness of being the real totality, and since that which presents itself immediately as constituting this totality is the form that this totality which is constituted has just taken. In other words, the advent of the spirit, it is not a new start from zero. It does not require a recommencement of the experience from its first moment, since on the contrary, it from the outset is only an awareness of that which has already been constituted as totality, and which lacked in order to be effectively this totality, only to be self-consciousness of totality. The spirit is not born ex nihilo, it emanates directly from that which is not yet it, but whose destiny is precisely to transform itself into it. To use an expression from the real philosophy, the disease of the animal is to become spirit. Like the bird of Minerva, which takes flight at the fall of day, the mind, when it appears in an already constituted experience. And to the extent that it is conscious of this constituted totality, it will be first conscious of what it appears to itself, then by a regressive process, conscious of what it in turn constitutes it. The light illuminates little by little, more and more deeply, the dark depths from which it is born. A regression doubled by a progression. If it consisted in only this process of regression from the most complex to the simplest, the second part of the phenomenology of spirit would risk returning to a primary source of knowledge, which would be sensation as pure opposition of subject and object. The whole dialectical process would be at bottom the dialectic of empiricism in the manner of Hume. In fact, this regression towards the simplest is doubled by an inverse process, which accounts for this reversal of form to content. The first characteristic of this parallelism between the two parts of the phenomenology. If there is a passage from form to content at the very moment when mind appears, then it is because the mind, as the consciousness of total experience, takes as the content of what it aims at what in the experience prior to it was the form of this experience. When outside the realm of the mind, self-consciousness, for example, attained freedom, for the form of this freedom was a stoicism, which could have had a reality in the world, which could have asserted itself against any object, which indifferently would have been that of Chrysippus, Cato, Epictetus, or Boeti. That is, this Stoicism was a form of a Stoic consciousness in relation to which all content was contingent. But when the mind, by the regression which we have described, becomes conscious of the Stoicism as part of the totality of experience, then the Stoicism is taken up in this totality. It loses its character of empty form, and it becomes a concrete and determinate content which cannot be indifferently this or that, but which cannot represent a determinate moment in the conceptual movement of which the mind has intuition. Ultimately, the fact that the totality of the concept presents itself intuitively in the form of time implies that each moment of this totality is a temporal content, or that such a temporal content under Stoicism will be, and will be exclusively, the right of the person in Roman law. The regressive approach, from the most complex to the simplest, is therefore immediately completed as by a progressive approach, which, unfolding from the form of the experience to its content, proceeds from the poorest to the richest, from the most abstract to the most concrete. These two approaches, correlative in essence, are the same ones that we encountered in the analysis of the methods that Hegel used to arrive at the transcendental subject. They now appear as characteristics of the historical method in phenomenology. It is even the interplay of these two processes which makes the historical dimension appear in the midst of the transcendental investigation. When the regressive process, starting from this extreme transcendental complexity that an experience as simple as sensible certainty achieves, arrives on the road from the transcendental self to self-consciousness as the total reality, it turns out that the progressive approach, which goes from general and poor form of experience to what is richest in experience, it turns out that this approach leaves the general forms of experience for the concrete content. It is the conjunction of this self-consciousness and this appearance of the contents of experience which gives rise to the history by which the spirit becomes conscious of itself in the series of experiences. At this point, from the interference of the two methods, the spirit is born, and with it, history. If it were therefore a question of situating history in the phenomenology of spirit and showing its significance in relation to the totality of experience from its sensitive consciousness to its absolute knowledge, then we would have to refuse to make it a new direction which would be juxtaposed with the original direction. History is a level of transcendental investigation. It must necessarily appear by virtue of the methods used. When the regression steps towards the constituent subject is sufficiently deep, and when the progression towards a totality is sufficiently developed, then the BE we can see is composed in two stages. In the original project, the second part was not planned, and this hesitation, far from being necessarily proving that this addition was gratuitous and contingent, only shows what difficulties Hegel experienced in integrating into his explicit system what would be implicitly constituted by necessary extensions. Hegel hesitated to admit as a thesis what he posed as hypothesis. He hesitated to introduce a philosophy of history into a transcendental philosophy. But this transcendental method, formed under the Kantian influence and through the exercise of his youthful works, a requirement that this confrontation of the historical and the transcendental be resolved by a reconciliation.